Good morning, everybody. You're all having such a good time. I hate to interrupt, but we've got a little program to go into. So thank you for being here, and I'm sure people will continue to come in. That's all right, just like church. People come in, go as they please. Mostly we hope today, come. We're glad to have you here. We're launching into Coming Together Sunday, and lots going on at Westminster. The fall is opening, and we wanted to begin with a bang, and we invited someone who is well known to all of us, Krista Tippett, who is an award-winning journalist, the founder of On Being, and has been making a wonderful contribution to our life together as a human community over the last couple decades. Something you may not know about Krista is that when she was first starting Speaking of Faith, these many years ago, 22 years ago maybe, she came to church here and was part of our worshiping community. I remember where you sat. As far back and out of the way as possible. The anonymous thing. Well, there's no anonymity left for you, Krista, but we're glad you're back. Welcome back home to Westminster. I'll turn it over to you to get started, and we'll kind of have some dialogue here and then conversation. If you all have a chance to write a question or a comment, and we'll get it to Krista if we can.
Okay. Well, I didn't really prepare anything. I just, first of all, one doesn't yet take for granted being in a room full of people like this, and I also was prepared for there to be 5 people. So it's lovely that you're all here and to see your faces and to feel your energy, because didn't we miss each other's physical energy?
Yes.
I thought I might just, I was reflecting on, I do also feel like Westminster somehow has been along part of this journey from the very beginning. And I have a number of memories from being in this room, whether I was part of the event or watching the event or at church. And so it is lovely to be here because, one thing this fall of 2022 feels so different from the fall of 2021. And what I felt last year is that we all thought we were supposed to be feeling better and things were supposed to go back to normal. Yep. And we hadn't even begun to internalize what we've lived through, and we still have so much work to do with that. But I remember coming back from last summer, and everybody had a summer, but nobody felt rested, because we were exhausted, because we are exhausted. But I do have this feeling in myself. Now, I did get a sabbatical, but I do have this feeling that there is some energy restored, and it's probably because we get to be together more, as a simple explanation. And that's good, because we have a lot of work to do, right? We have a world to remake. And we still have a lot of healing to walk through with ourselves and with each other. I was thinking this morning about how, between Speaking of Faith and On Being, I just got more and more clarity that, well, for one thing, when the show was called Speaking of Faith, I think what people expected were the answers. And I realized, and we're used to that, and there was a lot of concern in public radio about, will this be proselytizing? And I realized that what I've always been interested in and what I was pursuing were the questions, the great animating questions that gave rise to our traditions and to faith and to theology. And that in fact, these are the great human questions. What does it mean to be human, and how do we want to live? Where did we come from, and where are we going? And what are we called to? And I'd say across the last decade, I also started to realize that there's a third question in that mix, and that's the question of who we will be to each other. And that in this 21st century, where our technologies have in fact connected us, we need to work on the quality of that connection. But the connection is there, and it is extraordinary. Where, in fact, the challenges and crises and callings before us are global, are universal. That question of who we will be to each other is absolutely now inextricable from the question of what it means to be human and how we want to live. So if I think of the great existential, and I want to say, I don't want to always say crisis, I want to say challenge, I want to say calling before us, ecological, racial, economic. We really have to reinvent what an economy is for, what politics are for, as much as how they function. And that, whether we rise to a generative, life-giving, not just explanation, but lived experience of who we can be to each other, that move is central to us rising to these challenges. And that is, and I know this is language you like as much as I do, that is work of moral imagination, as much as it is also work of pragmatism and building, and sometimes deconstructing and decomposing to build what we need. And I also have thought a great deal in recent years about how then theology, the theological imagination and theological and virtues and theological vocabulary is as relevant, more relevant, I would say, in the middle of our life together as at any time in my lifetime. How we need the language and the rituals and the formation in confession and repentance and redemption, and also, on the way to healing, lamentation. We don't know how to do those things in our political life together, in our economic life together. We don't even know how to talk about them really in our public spaces. But it is that language that we need, and not just, as I say, the language, but all that they are filled with from the depths of our tradition. Ritual and text and teaching and wisdom and community and practices. And finally, I'll just say I was aware this morning, and when you extended this invitation, September 11th.
No.
And I didn't get to read my New York Times all the way through this morning because I was getting ready to come here, but I didn't actually see anything.
No reference to it?
I did not see a reference to it. Maybe there was in one of the sections. But to me, 9/11 is a case in point of how we don't do lamentations, how we don't know how to grieve and mourn and lament, and that is to say, we don't know how to sit with what has happened to us and find in it, with some stillness and reflection, what it would teach us, right? And this is what we do as human beings and in families. When we have a loss, a grief, a terrible, terrible event, a tragedy, an accident, it's a very strange thing about our species, actually, that those are often the moments when we grow. We don't wish they'd happened. We don't wish them on anyone else. But there's something about our species that we are very often made by what would break us. And I really, as we get farther and farther away from 9/11, which was right at the beginning of the century, I feel like so much of what has gone wrong, there's a line back to that. Because one thing that happened on 9/11 is that this country came into kinship with countries and people all across our planet who know in every moment that they are fragile, even in their strongest fortresses, right? What happened to us, some variation of that, happens all the time, every day in our world. But we never thought it could happen to us. And so part of our reflection might have been to take in that fragility as part of our condition, and also the fact that the political, historical dynamics, geopolitical dynamics of that weren't something new that was unleashed on the 21st century. They made visible realities of our world that had been building for centuries, and it was a manifestation of human and religious and political and historical dynamics that had really had a lid over them during the Cold War, been manipulated on every side of the Cold War, and then they were coming to expression. And but rather than saying, what do we need to learn here? What do we need to reckon with here? We moved immediately, as we do, to what felt like strength, which was anger and revenge, right? And I'm not saying that there shouldn't have been a geopolitical response, but what we don't know how to do is also have a deep human response, and that is the human underpinning of our life together and of our politics. So those are the things I've been thinking about.
Yeah, Krista, aren't we in a similar moment right now? I mean,
I think so.
In some ways even writ large, because the whole world experienced the scourge of COVID.
Yeah.
Some parts of the world more than others, but we kept talking, I remember early in COVID, about what this is exposing about us. And about our healthcare system, about how we're interconnected around the world. And you'd think this would be a moment when the kinship of the human family would somehow rise to the surface more than it apparently has.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing about having this conversation right now is that we're at the moment where we can all work with the direction this takes, and what do we do with it? I agree. I mean, I think what happened with COVID was the ground shaking beneath the feet of every single person, with obviously lots of variation in how safe we were or could be, but how extraordinary to have an experience that the entire human family experiences. Mm-hmm. And then, I really feel like, I think of there being kind of different chapters of COVID, I've been saying the post-2020 world, right? Because it's also not over, it's not the post-COVID world.
I see you're accessorized with the mask.
My
Just in case.
Just one of the changes.
It's not over.
It's not over, but I really feel like so part of my frustration, I mean, among all the despair I was feeling along with everybody else, was we kept being given these massive wake-up calls, right? Like the meaning of the word apocalypse is not the cataclysm to end all cataclysms. It's an uncovering. Mm-hmm. And there was one uncovering after the other, like what we were given to see and what had become unseeable. And the first one, and you remember, there were those kind of innocent months in the very beginning where we first of all thought it would be over soon. But we had to ask, as a society, what is essential and what is non-essential? Like if ever there was a values question, a question of moral imagination, a question of theology, there you are. And every profession that was deemed essential had something to do with care. And we also had to take in that those are not professions that we reward. Like we reward everything that was deemed non-essential. I'm probably exaggerating, but it's almost that simple. So this was the first question, like, how do we put care at the center of our lives, of our society, which scientifically we're learning now, even evolutionary biologists are understanding we only flourish as a species because we care for each other, because we know how to cooperate, not all the time, but sometimes. So there was the care question, and we never got to it. Like, to me, all of these have lined up, and now we have to see them. And then, of course, George Floyd was murdered in our city, right? And again, it was an uncovering. It's not something the likes of which had never happened before, and the likes of which have happened since. But enough of us who hadn't understood this as part of our ongoing story, because I think we had softened, right? I think this pandemic had softened us. We were aware of our fragility. And it penetrated. You know, I had interviewed Resmaa Menakem right before the pandemic, this great trauma specialist of racialized trauma in the body here, who lives here. And we were supposed to put that on the air the week that the lockdown started. And I knew that it was such an important show. And Resmaa also said, it won't penetrate now. I mean, people are just, and, you know, everybody was just scared and what was going to happen next. So it couldn't penetrate, but that's what happened. When George Floyd was killed, it penetrated in a different way than it had before, for those of us who hadn't been aware that this was happening in our midst all the time. So there was the racial reckoning, again, laid before us. And then the West Coast caught fire that summer, which we kind of forget, you know? This thing we're living with now every summer, that's happening right now again. And then, perhaps, as tragically as all of that, the election of 2020 took our individual and communal reckoning with all of these things and put it in political trenches. And so really stopped all of this reckoning that are just, you know, just buried, contorted, paralyzed what we might be doing. So anyway, so I see, like, those are our reckonings, right? There they are. Those are the big three. And the problem with politics in the middle of it, and our structures, the problem with economics in the middle of it. Yeah, so here we are. What do we do with that? Do we now find it in ourselves to ponder what is before us and to pick up that work? This is the time.
Yeah, you say the primary, fundamental, sort of essential question before us is how will we live together?
Yeah.
The Rodney King question: can't we just learn to get along? Yeah. How will we be toward one another?
Will we be to each other?
You have referred in other conversations you've had to the avalanche of competing answers that just overwhelm us. Not many are asking questions, but everybody's got answers.
Yeah.
And not very many of them are helpful.
That's right. Yeah.
So talk about this the tension of competing answers, because, you know, particularly when you get into politics, it's pretty thick.
Yeah. I know. We're a society that is in love with answers, and we're in love with argument, and argument is my answer against your answer. And we think that, you know, somewhere along the way, of course, that all has a place. But somewhere along the way, we got this idea that that you're being really serious if you're arguing. And you're being really serious if you have an answer or an opinion. And it actually flies in the face of reality, because, you know, in science, but also in our lives, it's the asking of a better question that brings discovery and breakthrough. You know, that when we change, when we get transformed, is when our questions change. And that's also when we come up against the limits of what we know, and then we know we have to learn, and we have to walk into that learning. And if there's ever, like, that's a description of where we need to be as a society right now. Questions are a mighty form of words. And I think that intuitively we know that. I mean, we experience it all the time, but it's one of these places where it's like the asking of a good question, I would say, is just a basic like social technology or human technology, but it's kind of been driven out of us. We've kind of unlearned it, and so we have to relearn it.
Well, you have talked about your religious upbringing in just those terms.
Yeah.
The questions that were suppressed,
Yeah.
both in your life and in the life of
Questions
your family.
were, well, you know why? Because they were dangerous, because they were powerful.
So the church has gotten tangled up in this somewhat, in some ways that have not been helpful. Religion has either tamped down the good questions or provided answers to the wrong questions.
Yeah, and religious places are run by human beings and peopled by human beings, so we do all the things that human beings do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you move from an environment, the sort of Southern Baptist upbringing you had, where questions were not really encouraged or even allowed, to being a person whose life basically is asking questions of others?
Well, see, I think that is the point. But so sometimes people have said to me, "Oh, you must have grown up in a family where people had wonderful conversation and asked wonderful questions." I'm like, okay, it works two different ways. One way is you grow up in a family where all these things happen that you then follow, or you grow up in a family where none of that ever happened, and so you long for it, and that's what you do.
And then you become Krista Tippett.
to overcome your childhood. No, I literally lived in a family where, it was very steeped in a certain kind of religiosity. And, my grandfather's fear of questions was also a fear of his own mind, which I experienced him to be very intelligent, but he had a second-grade education, and he was scared of his questions, and he'd never been invited to bring them. And it was also in contrast, to the liveliness of his intellect and his good humor and his humility. But it's what he'd been taught to do. Mm-hmm. And also in my family, the things that this is a human thing too, right? The things that we might have been talking about that were hanging over everything were never discussed. So I think, I'm completely driven to be talking about the things that we're not discussing that we need to be talking about.
Speaking of questions, if you have some and they're on a card, just raise it and someone will circulate among you and grab them and bring them up to me after they've been screened. So let's engage the conversation fully here. The question, of course, about how we're going to be with one another is fundamentally a religious or spiritual question. Who will we be in the world, and who do we feel called or compelled to be because of our faith? Yeah. Then in your view, now speaking about the Christian religions in particular, because that's who we are here, are we engaging in this dialogue in the right way as the church? The rise of Christian nationalism, and what about those of us who want to reject that, and we try in our little ways in the pulpit occasionally, but are we on the right track in your view?
Well, what a big question. And also, it's such a big picture, right? And like even within evangelicalism, it's not one thing, but it's what we see that's most strident. And I guess so I really don't feel like I'm in a position to pronounce on that. But one thing I would say is, I think there's a tendency to feel, and this is not just in the religious realm, that one needs to stand up and reject what feels destructive in our society, right? What also feels like the antithesis of what we are for and about. And I know that that's true. I know there's a place for that. I mean, I'm aware of this kind of tension also within journalism. But if all you do is orient towards what you reject, it also starts to distort you. And I actually think I think that's a theological observation. Like, I think the sense of forgiveness, for example, is that you don't let yourself be captive, right? That you fill yourself up with what you want to fill yourself up, and that not be, so you do it for yourself in a way, right? But it ends up being something, it also is a stance towards the other. I think what's really important that feels a little bit less intuitive right now, and really, I mean, for all of us, even on an individual level, is to also lean into what we are about, what we love, what we are passionate about and for, and really represent that and embody that as a counterweight rather than necessarily as a rebuttal, right? And that's actually what is, we can't really use the word contagious anymore, but like is contagious, you know, like in a good way.
Yeah. Tell us at Westminster Church, a particular congregation in the city racked by, even this weekend, more gun violence and racial issues, and a church that is engaged actively in the city in many ways. Tell us, what do you think the questions are that ought to guide our life together in this congregation?
Well, here's what I want to say. That's the right question.
Okay.
I think part of the reason, look, everything that is before us that I described is overwhelming. It's massive, it's existential, it's terrifying, and we don't know where we can plug our little life into it, right? And it becomes paralyzing when we think that that's what we're supposed to know what to do, right? That we are supposed to know. And we don't. And we actually, and here's another good theological, religious word, we need to be in discernment about that. And this is another American thing, like we want the answers and we want to rush to the answers and we want the action and we think we're only being effective if we're acting. But where we are facing crises and conditions that are truly new in the history of our species, really the most rational and powerful thing is to say, we have to be in discernment about this. We have to reflect on it. We have to figure out what that right action might be. And we can also do it together. And, I just think there's something in us, like if you said, we're going to have a process of question, of letting the questions in our midst rise and be articulated, and letting our questions lead us, being in a period of discernment. I think that would be countercultural, and I think it's the only powerful move to make.
To do so will require us to learn to listen.
To learn to listen and to learn to sometimes listen to the not knowing.
Yeah.
I mean, if anybody here has listened to On Being, you've probably heard me mention Rainer Maria Rilke, and you've probably heard me mention the phrase living the questions. And I really do believe that is the spiritual discipline for the 21st century. And here's the sense of what Rilke said. Essentially, that when we have questions for which we do not have answers, and I would say for which to rush to answers would be presumptuous, would not in fact honor the seriousness of what's before us, then what we're called to do is love and hold and live the questions themselves and live our way into answers. So this is a very robust, this is an active holding of questions. And I will also say that I've been living with this teaching for 20, 30 years, and I have actually practiced, and I think we've practiced as an organization, this as a discipline. And I will report to you that when you are faithful to a question that question will be faithful back to you. But it's not a horizon of like a 6-week study. It's like if you, right? It's like if you said, here we are, September 11th, 2022, and let's formulate our questions, and let's come back to this a year from now and see what we've discerned and what we've learned.
And think about the questions we didn't ask or engage 21 years ago on September 11, 2001, or in 1963 in the bombing in Birmingham where the girls were killed, or on and on, all these uncoverings in our history where we have missed the opportunity.
Yeah. And it's like a question, if you're holding a question, it's going to point you down, it's going to say, walk down this road. It's going to have you look at things. You need to carry it like a companion over your shoulder. And see what it asks you to look at, see what it asks you to investigate, and experiment with, and see how it wants to change you.
So who do you see is doing this well in your conversations, or what communities maybe are doing this well?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of communities are doing this or trying to do it, and it's just not the stories we hear. I mean, I think you're trying to do it. I can tell, like, this conversation is a manifestation of you walking into this. I mean, I think if I have to look at a person who I feel embodies this in our society, it would probably be Brian Stevenson. Mm-hmm. Who has just been led by his nose for, when did he start? I mean, it's
the Equal Justice Initiative?
Yeah, was it like early 90s, I think? Yeah, he's about my age. Yeah. He walked into a situation, he had kind of volunteered himself for something that he didn't really know much about or why he was doing it, and didn't expect it to be that important, but he stuck himself out there a little bit to volunteer while he was at law school to go visit a man on death row. And he let that change him. And he started asking all kinds of questions about why that experience wasn't represented in the legal training he was getting. And, then started Equal Justice Initiative, ended up also asking the question as he went through that it wasn't just people who were on death row, but people who are underrepresented or misunderstood in our society in other ways, right? And then I think, eventually he started asking the question of why, if they were winning all these courses at the Supreme Court, the foundations of this inequity weren't changing. And how do we change that? And it was that question that eventually led them to create, to build the memorial and the museum, because he said, we have to actually reckon with this history. But it's, I think the reason that is touching people, and it's touching people across our divides, is because the spirit of it is there's really hard, terrible things we have to look at that are part of our story, but it's in the spirit of let's move this story, let's participate in this story, let's reshape the story, let's make the next chapter of the story on the basis of having a full sense of reality. Mm-hmm. And I see all of that as every stage of that was him saying, what, asking the question.
Yeah. The other thing, he was a town hall forum speaker, as were you, and I remember him talking about the key for him was learning to get close.
Proximity. That's it. Yeah.
Close enough to listen and to experience, to be proximate to someone. Which requires you to engage in a way that you can't if you're doing this from a distance. And there's not much proximity happening. Yeah.
And also, I think that's so helpful. It's so practical. And it's also like where your question is going to be like, where do I need to get proximate? Like, where do I care? Where do I know that I don't know anyone or I don't understand anything? And then just, but it's like, I don't know. I think you probably grew up in this world that told us, change the world, save the world.
Yep.
That was such a problem. Because like we went out there and did it in our image, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
right.
this is what I think needs to, right? Oh, this is the world I'll save.
It's from a posture of privilege.
Objectifying, yes.
Yeah.
And actually, Isabel Wilkerson is somebody I've gotten really close to, and Isabel said to me a few years ago, like why after all these decades of the true progress that was made in civil rights in the 1960s, are we at a place where some of the foundations of that are being rolled back, right? And she said, because we changed the laws, but we didn't change ourselves. And laws are fragile. Laws can be unmade. And I think that is actually a learning of all of that, semi-transformation that happened in the 20th century. And I think we know things now that they didn't know. And again, this is intelligence that we carry with us. And so we have to know ourselves. We have to change ourselves, and we have to know that we don't have the answers to save the world. And so we get proximate in order to figure out what the right question, what are the questions we should be asking, and to see beyond what we understand are the limits of our knowledge. And that is the only thing that we will be able to work with that will be meaningful.
Mm-hmm. We're dedicating our bells today that were installed the week we locked down in COVID, and we've been waiting to dedicate them for 2.5 years. And we're going to ring for the first time on them the Westminster chime, which of course is what originated out of the Westminster Abbey, which of course is the place of a funeral coming.
I was going to say, are you going to do 96 times for the...
So,
I've had the BBC on a complete loop for 3 days.
So here's a moment for the British people, one of these sort of moments where things are uncovered about a system they're living with and have lived with a long time. Any reflections on on the ritual that will take place there and the way the Brits seem to be managing this or not managing it?
Well, I don't know. I'm very deep in British. So in 2016, I decided that I was going to stop listening to or reading American news because I was so discouraged by the fixation on Donald Trump, who I think is a symptom more than, problematic, but he was a symptom. And the fixation on the person of Trump and actually everybody orienting around that. Right? And so I thought, I'm just going to listen to the BBC, and I'm going to read The Guardian, because I know that if something happens, I really need to know. But it's not going to be all the news all the time. And then, so that took me down this slippery slope of getting emotionally involved in Brexit, and now I'm
Emotionally involved in Brexit?
Yes, so I've had to live with our politics and their politics. It's been really hard. But I have to say, I noticed, I really immediately when I heard that the Queen had died, I turned on BBC Radio 4, I have the app, and that's all I've been listening to. And then somebody was telling me that there's a lot of critical coverage in the States, well, here's what she did wrong. And I don't know. I know that is all real. I guess there's something I'm kind of envying in them right now, which is their ability to have public ritual. And, there's this national process of grieving that's going to stretch out over several weeks. And they are ending up, it's not just about this person of Elizabeth, it's about the history that she kind of presided over. I don't know, I've also watched this, from her to King Charles, who everybody has opinions about, and he's...
Why did you put quotes around King Charles?
Because I'm not used to it yet.
He is the king.
I'm not used to it yet. And I think, as soon as we get past this round of grieving, we know that the UK, like the rest of Europe, is heading for a terrible winter, and so it's going to get real again, and the pageantry won't. But there has been something to... I kind of wish we had places that were less... it's so funny to grow older, right? Because when I was young and I even lived in the UK for a while, I was like, this is ridiculous, We're so much better, we're so enlightened, we're so beyond that. But there's something about these countries that have a figurehead that has some constancy, and then all the other drama can happen. And I'm just watching this very peaceful transition take place, but it has all this, all this ritual is associated with it that is old. And there's something about, it's the same thing about liturgy, right? There's something about, even if you on any given day don't agree with every word of a creed or a prayer, that or a psalm, right? That you are speaking words that countless millions of human beings have spoken before you.
And will speak after you.
And will speak after you. There is something profoundly humanizing and sacred in that. And we don't have that in our public life, right? Which is all about being rebels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the space the church at its best occupies. Mm-hmm. That space of liturgy, the work of the people, the public work of ritual or lament or celebration or exploration. I don't know how we move from spaces like this, where that happens, into a civic space.
Yeah.
Actually, the bells.
There's another good question.
Yes, good. There you go. The bells are raising this question for me because I think of them primarily as a sort of an expression of who we are. Our motto is a telling presence, and now our presence is audible downtown. And so I think, we're kind of broadcasting our presence here. Some of our neighbors think other thoughts about the bells. And others of them think they're really wonderful civic expression.
Yeah.
But they're all interacting with our bells in fascinating ways. I think because people want a symbol, a ritual, a sound even, around which that they can find common cause. And in our setting here, of course, it's the text, really, the scriptures we read every week. How do we, as a congregation, you probably don't have an answer. You're going to say this is a good question. But
Yeah.
It's so powerful for those of us who sing a hymn and find ourselves weeping as we sing.
Yeah.
That experience ought not to be hidden behind the walls.
Yeah. I agree with you. And I do. I think it's a question to live. I was thinking this week, also as I was listening to them sing God Save the King over and over again, I was thinking about how in my childhood, which was during the Cold War, and we have to remember how that supercharged patriotism and actually, I think, supercharged our faith in capitalism, about how we did a lot of really ritual singing of, my country 'tis of thee, America the beautiful, and then, of course, Star Spangled Banner. So we almost had this, which I'm not saying that was good for us, but there is something good for us about that kind of experience, which is what you're saying. And we don't have that anymore, and I don't think we should come back to those national hymns in that way. But we are a really ritual poor society. And again, some of the young people I'm listening to who are so, I think, really, really pointing at the future and just have this, who are looking at the natural world to see how vitality works and saying, why is this not see how we've built a world and with structures that aren't anything like this, and who are looking at emergence and looking at, using language of mathematics about fractals, and understanding that even when you have a huge pattern, like you have patterns constantly repeating, and this is true, this is just true, beyond the natural world, that that there's this real importance that we can undervalue of the pattern that is our little life, because actually it is making the larger patterns, and that we, in ways that we can't perceive and in ways that also fly against our desire for things to happen right away or in a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 year increment, what we do is building something that that gets built upon. And now I can't remember why I went down that road. What were we, what were we talking about?
Well, I want to actually talk about
Yeah.
practices, which is
Yeah.
kind of what we're talking about
Yeah.
here too. That may be how we move from this space to, to civic space.
I think it's part of the imagination work to do, like that. No, this is reality I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's not the reality of hierarchies. It's not the way we built institutions. But it is actually how reality works. It is actually how vitality works. Mm-hmm. So if we know that, and we just let that kind of reshape, remold our vision.
Yeah. You mentioned the BBC thing, I think, is what might be described as one of your practices, as a way to listen to different sources,
Yeah.
a way to engage the world in a different way. What are other practices that we might use to do this kind of remaking the world together work to which we are called?
Well,
And you can't say that's just a good question.
no, I won't say that. I'm not somebody who gives a lot of advice, but I will just share with you a practice that I started this summer, which I'm finding so amazing. So I've been on sabbatical this summer, and so I had a different rhythm of life, and I'm managing to keep this going right now, but I don't know if that will happen forever. But I want to just, I really believe in journaling, and I've had some conversations that have helped me understand that it's more than just something that feels good or that we're glad to have diaries. That, like, something I heard recently that made so much sense to me was when we write with our hands, we're doing emotional processing, whereas when you're just clicking the keyboards, you're not, right? And that made so much sense to me about why sometimes when I really want to write something and I sit down at my computer, it just doesn't come out. But when we write, it's just our body and our mind and our spirit and our memories, they're all connected up. And then the other thing about me is that I love books. I love reading, right? I've always felt when I loved a book, that somehow the author was my friend, and that if I ever ran into them when I was growing up, I knew I was going to run into them in heaven one day, right? And that we'd be buddies, and like they'd know me and I'd know them. So one thing that I think that, I do have a meditation practice, but because that is a spiritual technology that is really teaching us as a species, but it's not my favorite thing, and I'm not especially good at it, and I don't do like 30 minutes a day. But I think it's hard, and I think it's worth trying, and I think it's worth doing, but it's hard. And I do recommend, like, if you kind of want a companion in it, like what I call contemplative reading, which is just get a book, and it might be a book of poetry, or just a book that you like that stretches you or soothes you, and just take a poem a day or a paragraph, and let that be kind of your prayer, your silence. Kind of engage with that, and that's also something that doesn't have to take very long. But this summer, something I started doing that I'd never done before is having a notebook with me. And actually, I bought big art notebooks, so like big, huge pages. I'd have the book on the notebook, and because I've realized recently that I think and learn conversationally. And so I realized, like, I could treat this reading like I'm in conversation with this book. And it actually has been a beautiful experience where I read. I spent a lot of time with Mary Oliver, but also some other books that had very heady ideas that I had to read really slowly. And just kind of be reading, and sometimes just copying out beautiful sentences and paragraphs. So I will have them, but also I found that I came into conversation with what was happening in this text, and then I would kind of write what I was thinking, and then return to the reading. And I want to recommend that. Because I also think, again, when we have so much discernment to do, as we know, and we have so much work to do, it's also kind of this American thing that I'm supposed to figure it out by myself, right? Like I'm supposed to be able to sit down at my computer or with my journal and write profound things and come to conclusions. But we're communal creatures, and communing with a book, with a piece of writing, is also communing.
Or with a community.
Or with a community, or take a book, or do a group where everybody's journaling with a book, and then come back together and share it.
We have time, I think, for about one more question, and it's related to the word imagination you used a moment ago, which is often a word we kind of assign to children, because they can get into imagination in ways that we adults, we've long lost that capacity. Kind of need to recover that. But what role does imagination play in our collective work to remake this world?
I think imagination is the most underrated, like underestimated power, superpower that we have. And if you look at any part of history, if you look at any change that has happened, and I don't just mean uprising, I mean where there's been transformation that has been generational in nature, it's because there were people who were walking with and towards a reality that did not yet exist. And they believed that they could make it real. And, John Lewis is my favorite person like that, who just said, like, we lived as if. He said, like, the beloved community is real. We just have to show it. We just have to show that it's real. We live as if. And, this is also what I think hope is about. Because we have this with this app that we're experimenting with, so maybe I'll come back and tell you more about that. We can invite people to join as we get a little closer to it. But so I did a course on hope, and I really dug into our archives. I'm like, what is this? What is hope? And because I don't use the word optimism very much, and I'm really not about, for me, hope has nothing to do with wishful thinking. It's nothing to do with idealism, and it is a muscle. And it is primarily, and I was looking back at the interviews I've had with people like Brian Stevenson or Jane Goodall and other people who are not as famous, but who have moved things, who've shifted things. Hope is, in the first instance, a leap of imagination that has real-world consequences. And that is just to say, okay, here's everything that's going wrong, here's what has to be fixed, here's what's not good enough, here's what's catastrophic. I refuse to believe that the world has to be that way. That's the first move hope makes. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to live like that. And I'm going to throw my life behind another possibility, right? This other vision I have of how it could be, how we could be to each other. And that's hope, right? And that is, like, imagination is absolutely central in it. We don't believe in this society and the power of ideas, and that in itself is an ideology. But this is why books are so important. Like, ideas do matter, and what ideas are the power of human imagination, seeing what can be that is not yet. And it is absolutely what moves the world forward. And it's fun to be creative.
I'm thinking of Mitri Raheb, who is a Palestinian Christian leader.
Yeah.
If you haven't interviewed him, he'd be a good subject. But he says hope is what we do.
Yeah.
It's not something we have, it's what we do. In other words, we take our imagination and then we walk it out onto the street and do it. And one of his community lives in a little farm surrounded by hostile settlements, and they have a sign, a hand-lettered sign posted outside, and it says, "We refuse to be enemies."
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to go that way.
Right.
We're going to use our imagination and
Right.
move in a different direction.
Yeah.
Well, this is a great conversation. Is there anything you wanted us to know about your next chapter? You've got about a minute to tell us.
Well, just we're not doing the weekly radio show, because that was a life of constant deadlines. And but we are going to have a new season of this. We're going to do a bunch of new shows in the new year, which we're already producing. But also we're going to be doing. I just want to be more present to the quiet conversations that need to happen in the middle of our life together that can't happen in public right now. I believe one of our teachers is John Paul Lederach, who's a Mennonite peace builder, huge on moral imagination, creativity, social creativity. And he's really helped wars end, and he's helped societies rebuild and remake. And he says, the thing we pay attention to in history is critical mass, right? Bunches of people on the street. And he's like, that is a stage. That is something that happens when transformation happens. But before that and after that, if what really happens is that the conditions that gave rise to the crisis are remade so that you really do make a new world, it's critical yeast that happens. And that, he defines, starts with small groups of unlikely people, of unlikely combinations of people in a new quality of relationship. Like in discernment, right? Asking these questions. And it kind of gets back to the fractals idea. So that's where I think we're in discernment about how do we support that. And we are going to also be creating tools for people and groups. And so I'd love to just stay in touch with you. Maybe you could be kind of part of our laboratory.
Sure, we'd be glad to do that. We are kind of a living laboratory of questions and listening anyway, as you observe.
Yeah.
Krista, thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for your role in our broader community and in our lives. And you're already part of Remaking the World Together by what you're doing and by who you are. So let's thank Krista for that. I'm going to head this way with Krista. You all are probably going to need to take a break for a moment and come back in for church. The stage is going to be dismantled and carried out that direction. So we're going to have to, and see the crew all ready to go. We're going to have to keep this area open and maybe use that way to get out if you need to go out. We'll see you back in here for worship. There's a wonderful prelude starting at 10:15. Thank you. Terrific.